Welcome to the Dawn of War Crucible tutorial. Today we will be zooming out to look at how to create your own strategy and how to counter your opponents. There are a few things you would want to think about before the start of the game. Firstly, the matchup. Knowing your own factions and your opponent's faction strengths and weaknesses is key to developing a strategy to beat them. To give a few examples, when facing Necrons you do not want to leave them alone for long periods of time. Their economy will grow faster than any of their faction if they're not pressured. When facing demons, you can expect a lot of early aggression using melee units, so you need to be ready to get units or buildings to deal with their aggressive horde playstyle. Secondly, power spikes. Factions are not equally strong at all stages of the game. Knowing when a faction is strong and weak will help you understand what you should be doing at various stages of the game. Is your faction strong in tier 1 and your opponent's weak? You should probably try to apply pressure. Is it the opposite? Prepare to defend. Is your faction going to be much stronger if you tech up? Can you afford to spend those resources or will you die before the power spike hits? It's better to have an idea in your head of these things before the game, so that when you're in the middle of the game you're not overwhelmed by all the decisions you have to make. And lastly, you want to think of a build order. This should take into account the matchup and the map, and plan your build accordingly. If a map is small with a short rush distance, then you may need to build more units early, whilst a bigger map with more requisition points will require you to get more builders and cappers early. The standard build order that I show in my guides is designed for a map with 5 to 6 strategic points per side and a relatively small map. I suggest that you start thinking about why I made the build order the way I did and how it can be adjusted depending on the map. So how would you create your own build order? Well, the best way is to focus on economy or a timing attack. Go into skirmish and start a match with sandbox mode on or versus an AI that you find easy to beat. See how much economy you can get by 10 minutes, or see how quickly you can get a certain unit to do a timing attack. Unfortunately, I can't be more specific than this, as the build order changed drastically depending on the matchup and your opponent, but here are some common tips that should apply in most games. 1. You should start with 3 cappers and 1 to 2 combat units in tier 0, but after that spend as few resources on units as possible. Do not reinforce your units unless you absolutely need to. In tier 0, your goal is to get all your listening posts built and upgraded as soon as possible, so focus on that. Once you get into tier 1, unless you are doing some kind of aggressive push, your focus should be on getting the researches on your listening posts and generators, and upgrading your listening posts to tier 2. You may note that trying to do this will mean that you will run out of power. You should build extra generators a little bit in advance so that you can upgrade your listening posts as soon as possible. If you plan to go for power-hungry units, you will need a second HQ pretty quickly as well. Remember that economy buildings for all factions cost a lot of power, so if you plan on increasing your economy further, you will need more HQs to afford them earlier. So you have decided on your own strategy, but what about your opponent? It is important to also know what your opponent is doing. Are they getting a massive blob of infantry? Or are they building vehicles? How is their economy compared to yours? What technology level are they at? These questions are vital to understanding and countering what your opponent is trying to do. The minimap is a very useful tool for quickly seeing your opponent's movements whilst focusing on something else, but it is also good to know what is going on in their base. The act of sending units at your opponent solely for the purpose of figuring out what they are doing is called scouting. So what units are good at scouting? The units should be cheap, fast, preferably with a jump. Pick a side path that your opponent is unlikely to defend and run your unit in. Flying units are especially adept at this due to their ability to go over terrain. Alternatively, some factions have a way to reveal a portion of the map. Units and abilities that do that are also very good for scouting. Now that you know what your opponent is doing, it's time to figure out how to counter them. In Crucible, countering your opponent's unit's armor type with the right weapons is very important. Weapons used against the wrong armor type will do basically no damage, and very few units are effective versus all armor types. And those that are, usually do less damage than their specialized counterparts. You can see your unit's armor type in the middle of its unit card, under the owner of the unit. And you can click on the enemy units to view their armor types. You can see what units a weapon is effective against in the description when you're buying the unit or weapon. You should not refer to the description of the unit itself, as that is often inaccurate. There are 5 major armor types in the game and 5 niche ones. Major armor types are self-explanatory. You pick the weapons that say they are good versus these armor types and you should be good. These armor types are infantry, heavy infantry, vehicle, structure, and commander. On screen right now you can see the subtypes that fall under these armor types. These do not require a different counter, they simply define how resistant to damage the unit is. Niche armor types are ones that you will not see often and usually require specific counters. Monster, you will see very few weapons specifying that it's effective versus monster. That is because this armor type is usually treated similarly to heavy infantry, so if you get weapons effective versus heavy infantry, you should be good. Aircraft, reserved for flying units. Similarly to monster, very few units will specify that they're effective versus aircraft, but usually anti-vehicle weapons counter them as well. Demon, reserved for special units such as the Sisters, Angels and Greater Demons. Require a specific counter and weapons that say they are effective versus demons. Titan, reserved for big endgame units, similar to Demon, often requires a specific counter, but some anti-vehicle weapons can also do okay versus them. Living Metal, the rarest armor type, unique to Necrons. Usually melee weapons are much more effective against them, and living metal units are immune to nukes. There is another type of damage that weapons can do, morale damage. This refers to how much damage a unit will do to the blue bar underneath your health. Losing morale significantly reduces accuracy, so units that do a lot of morale damage can easily cripple enemy forces. Furthermore, some Titans use morale as a shield that you need to break through before you can damage its health. Weapons that are effective versus Titan are not necessarily effective versus morale, so you will need units that do good morale damage to get rid of the shield before your anti-Titan units become effective.